Welcome to the 10th session of our 2022 to 2023 Heritage and Colonialism Discussion Group. This year's talk centers around the theme Legacies of Injustice. And this theme encompasses a broad range of injustices in both the past and the present, which are connected to a complex web of colonial issues.
Without further delay, we would like to warmly welcome today's speaker, Matipa Mukondiwa. Matipa is a third-year PhD candidate in the Department of Geography at the University of Cambridge. At Cambridge, she's proud to have started and to co-organize Black Geography, a seminar series which foregrounds the experiences and work of Black geographers and students. Matipa's topic today will be land, labor, and identity in Zimbabwean education. Welcome, Matipa. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. And thank you, Isabella, Stanley, and Rhea for having me and for organizing this important series of talks. So, like Isabella said, I'm a third-year PhD student, and my research is about what education in Zimbabwe can tell us about coloniality, decoloniality, and post-colonial nationalism. So I'm going to jump right into it. And this picture on this opening slide is my favorite picture from fieldwork that I took. And why I love it so much is because in this image, we see the chefs in the background who were making the lunch for the students at the school that I was researching. And the school is called Prince Edward School, which I refer to as PE for short. And just above the kitchen hatch, you can see the Rhodes and Selous and Jameson house shields or banners. And I'm sure we all know who Cecil John Rhodes is, but just in case anyone doesn't know who Cecil John Rhodes is, Cecil John Rhodes created the British South Africa Company and came to Southern Africa and stole a lot of land. And Rhodesia was subsequently named after him. Selous helped the British South Africa Company gain lots of big tracts of land in parts of Zimbabwe, and Leander Starr Jameson was one of the leading pioneers who helped the pioneer column, who were the initial settlers who arrived in Zimbabwe. And then to the right of these banners, we see art that was done by students in the post-independence era. And this art is depicting a lot of, I think, interesting themes in Blackness. So why I love this picture and why I've opened with this picture is because we see a lot of things happening at the same time. So we see coloniality, we see post-colonial nationalism, we see labor dynamics, we see Blackness all operating at the same time, which is essentially what my thesis discusses. So I'm going to jump straight into it. So why is Prince Edward important? So this image to the right is an image that I took in the field, and I was stuck in traffic when I took it. And you can just basically see the cars, there's the guy with his bike, there's a person with a Pepsi moving cart in the background selling snacks and drinks. And you can kind of see the Prince Edward Street sign. So this picture just conveys like the busyness and the hustle and bustle, because PE as a school is in the CBD, and this was the case even in Rhodesia. It was in the center of Salisbury. So it's centrally located, which I think is really important. And because of this central location, it's also a 20 to 25-minute walk from Kopi, which is where the pioneers arrived and put up the Union Jack in 1890. And PE is a government school, which is perfect for the post-colonial nationalism discussion that I'm advancing in my thesis, but also as a school where there are young people. I think that focusing on young people is a unique way to enter the coloniality and decoloniality debates, which have tended to focus on the university, as I'm sure we all know. So PE is also important because of the land that it's on, which I'll go into great depth in this presentation. And there's a settler coloniality link with this land. And something I can't go into depth in this talk, but which is just as important, is because of the heritage and prestige that surrounds Prince Edward as a school, it was used in the 1980s and 1990s as a tool by the Black middle class for upward social mobility. So what did I do and why? I wanted to know how students understand their history curricula in relation to my key themes of coloniality, decoloniality, and postcolonial nationalism. And I also wanted to see if these understandings paralleled or didn't parallel histories of land dispossession and labor in Harare, which are also important to my key thesis themes. And I also just want to stress that I was not only interested in students' understandings of these, but those of teachers and general staff. General staff is a category in my research, which denotes all members of staff in a school who are not teachers. So like the chefs who we saw in the opening slide, the ground staff, the general hands, the carpenters, the matrons of the hostels. So my research had 4 aspects. It was autoethnographic, because the story is based off of my experience going through the Zimbabwean education system and that of my family and friends. There was archival collection that was done at the National Archives of Zimbabwe and the Prince Edward School Archives. I shadowed 2 teachers and I went to school essentially with 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, and 17-year-olds. And I also interviewed 31 people, a range of teachers, students, and members of general staff. So what does the Zimbabwean education system and schools like PE rest on, metaphorically, but also quite literally? This map here is a map that I have taken from African urban historian Tineo Yoshikoni's work, and he took this map from historian David Beach's book, the Shona and Their Neighbors. And this map is basically showing pre-colonial Shona polities in the Harare area. There's a lot going on in this map, but the most important thing that I want to draw your attention to is the 3 chiefs who I've circled, Chiweshe, Wata, and Seke. And at the confluence of all their areas of influence, in the middle there, vaguely, that is where Prince Edward is located. So why is this important? Well, this is showing the ties to the various Shona ties to land way before we can even start to think of other people who arrived and made claims to this land. So before Chiweshe and Wata was Chief Mbari, and then who was their relative, and then Chiweshe and Wata overthrew him. And then they ended up having a fight, which is what the second bullet on the slide shows us. So this is all based off of research collected from the National Archives. But what's really important and interesting is that Gutsa's people, so Chiweshe, went to collect cane rats in the vley beyond Prince Edward School gum plantation. And in doing so, they encroached onto Wata's country. And obviously Wata objected to this. So what we're seeing here is Prince Edward as a school, its land and its plantation is implicated in these fights that are happening, and these contestations that are happening between these chiefs. I want to just say that I'm discussing chiefs here and their various contestations, not in the cliche way that colonial officials portrayed African and Black chiefs as like animalistic or barbaric when they were fighting, but just to show that there were various forms of power being negotiated on land before we can even think of any other people who will make claims to this land. So this is one story. This is one important aspect where we see various Shona ties to land. But there are also other ties and claims made to the land in Zimbabwe. So this first image here is also an image that I got from the National Archives of Zimbabwe. And I can't quite tell who in the picture is who and who's doing what, but basically one of those men is Prince Edward of Wales, who the school is named after planting a tree at PE in 1925, after the school was named after him. And then in the second frame is an image I took in the field of the same tree. And then in the third frame, we see a plaque memorializing and commemorating the fact that Prince Edward planted this tree in 1925. So this is an important slide because even though this archival image is from 1925, and then the pictures I took are from last year in 2022, we're seeing really the longue durée of colonial white settler claims to land in Zimbabwe, especially to the school, Prince Edward, and to education as an institution. And what I found really interesting when I was at PE was that this tree and the fact that Prince Edward planted it were still being memorialized. Obviously, trees like this cannot be cut in Zimbabwe. It is illegal, I believe, but I still found it quite interesting that there was this memorialization happening. So in these last two slides that I've just shown, we see Shona claims to land, but we're also seeing settler and British claims to the land that the school is on. So this takes me to my argument about land. So this is an image that I took from the Mail and Guardian. And in it, they do not tell us which farm compound this is and what had just happened, but everyone looks really happy in this and jovial in this image. But what's really important is, I don't know if you can see the member of ZANU-PF who's in the foreground, he's wearing the Vote ZANU-PF t-shirt. And I think this is a really poignant image because we see the ties of land and people to the vision that ZANU-PF has of post-colonial nationalism in Zimbabwe. So land and the complexities of a fluctuating and contested identity. So for those who are not Zimbabwean, I'm not sure what you know about land in Zimbabwe, but land is quite political and is heavily contested, and most of the literature on the land has focused on the fast-track land reform program of 2000, which is referred to as the third Chimurenga. Chimurenga just meaning War of Liberation. So the first one was in 1896 to 1897, and the second one was in 1960s and the 1970s, and then the third Chimurenga is the land reform of the 2000s. And the literature, rightfully so, focuses on this important period in Zimbabwean history when the land was taken back. But what I'm most interested in is discussions in the literature that view land as symbolic and imbued with multiple meanings relating to nationality and identity. And we see this in, if we go back to the school, we see this with some of the students who I interacted with. So I had this interlocutor, Denzel, and I asked him what he knew about the history of the school. And he said, I know that the school was established in 1898, and and also it's a British school. And I asked him, it's a British school? Tell me more about that. He said, sorry, when it was established, it was like originally a British school. And then when the Zimbabweans took over, they decided that they were going to change the name to Chimurenga Boys High. But then the old boys and the other people, they rebuked that. And then I asked him, which other people? And he said, I wouldn't know. And then they just decided to keep the culture of the school, the British culture, and everything running. So it's a British school. And then I asked him, it's a British school, even to this day, it's a British school, just to confirm. And he said, humming in agreement, even though there are no Britons here, but then it's a British school because of the cultures and stuff. So this was a very interesting interview, and Denzel said some very interesting things. But what I found most interesting was that everywhere else in class and in the lessons, students were heavily, at times, deeply politicized with quite explicit decolonial thinking, narratives around post-colonial nationalism and land, and they were told that the land that was taken back was ours. And yet, for Denzel, PE was always British and was ultimately always a white school. And I'm designating how he says that PE is a British school, and I'm extending that ownership of the school to being British to also include the land that the school is on. And yet, if we take into account the earlier slides that I've just shown, we know that this is not the case because of the various Shona claims to this land. Mind you, sorry, one thing I forgot to mention was that historian Tsuneo Yoshikoni points out that the Chiweshe and Huata chieftaincies have actually continued fighting over the pieces of land that I showed you since like the 1930s and the 1980s. So that land remains contested. But for Denzel, the school is still always British. And so one of my arguments in my thesis is that this leaves the school to always be white in the imagination of students, even though that's not technically correct. But this erasure that we see happening with Denzel is only one aspect of the story, which is why I'm arguing that identity is really fluid, especially when it comes to land. The head of the history department at PE told me, we are teaching about our identity, about nationalism, about patriotism, loving your own country. And this is where we are today. We are saying, oh, Zimbabweans, get up, get the land. People are doing farming. Of course, it's not that efficient, but they were grabbed. We took our land from the whites. We are doing farming. So our syllabus and what is going on out there, they are hand in glove. We are working together. So this is what Mrs. Gwangwadza said to me. And what I found so interesting about this statement is that a lot of what she's saying is very in line with what ZANU-PF says about land. And she's explicitly tying land to identity and nationalism and patriotism. And she's saying, actually, what's happening in the politics of the country is what we're teaching the students. But we see that this is way more complicated if we compare her statement with what Denzel said in the earlier slide, where Denzel's like, actually, this is a British school. This is British land. And another student, I just didn't have the time or the space to include this. In an interview, another student actually just explicitly told me, this is a white school. It began as a white school. It was always a white school. So we see all these like breaks and fissures in how people conceive of our identity as Zimbabweans when thinking and talking about land. So this is an image that I took in the field, and it's the current president, Emerson Mnangagwa. And basically it's common practice for his picture to be hanging up in places of work. So if land helps us see the important nodes and erasures in Zimbabwean identity, analyses of labor show us erasures as well, but also the cracks in the post-colonial projects, a project over which Mnangagwa resides. So shifting a little bit from land and going to labor, why is labor and education important? A lot of the decoloniality debates have focused on the epistemic to the detriment of the material. There are a few exceptions to this. So I'm sure we are well aware of the Fees Must Fall movement, which began at the University of Wits. One thing that I loved so much about Fees Must Fall was Fees Must Fall recognized that as learners and as students within education, none of us are free unless we are free alongside the people who help the university be reproduced socially. So the people who are cooking and feeding learners and cleaning up after learners, which is that second bullet point there. And so another key argument that I'm making in my thesis is that the labor in schools is one way in which we can see the implications of the everyday experience under colonial and post-colonial governments. So similarly to the erasure of land that we saw with Denzel, we also see an erasure of Black labor historically at PE. So in this little blurb that I'm about to read to you, it's a letter from Prince Edward to the Chief Education Officer in 1952 that was collected in the PE archives. So the letter reads, unless it is proposed to have no native quarters at all in the grounds, these buildings should be sited with particular care. It is questionable whether they should be close to the hostels, since the temptation to wander away when opportunity offers is in that case strong. But if native quarters are at some distance from the school and hostels, native lavatory accommodation should certainly be provided near the place of work. The buildings can be unsightly and out of keeping with the rest of the school. There should therefore be enough room to make screening by trees possible. This is an awful letter. And this letter shows the colonial imagination. It's laced with like racist thinking and racist ideas. But this letter is most relevant for the argument I'm making here, because we can actually see within the very layout, architecture, and spacing of the school, how the chief education officer, in agreement with the Prince Edward School administration, was explicitly trying to erase the presence of the Black labor at the school, even though the labor was, these laborers were there and doing this work. And this is important, and this erasure carries on into the post-colonial present, because in the 10 months that I spent doing research at PE, I never actually saw where the general staff lived, because the PE administration and the government did not actually rectify this erasure. Whenever I spoke to members of general staff about where they lived and their living standards at PE, they would always just like vaguely signify to back there, the trees back there. I saw lots of trees hiding their homes, but I just never got to see them because the trees are hiding the homes. So in addition to this erasure, there's also precarity. And Bond Raurayanyika it means, directly translated, the bond has killed the nation. So the bond note, which is in this image here, is the form of currency introduced in 2016 by the governor of the Reserve Bank, John Mangujka. And it was supposed to be 1:1, one bond note is to $1. But I'm hearing that apparently right now, I think it's 1:1,200. $1 to 1,200, but I think anyone who has more accurate information can just correct me in the chat. But basically, this bond note in the government's mind was introduced to stabilize and reduce the hyperinflation and the cash shortages that were happening at the time. But this didn't actually do that. And I think what we're about to see from Alec shows just that. So in a conversation that I translated from Shona, Alec tells me, when there was the inclusive government, that's when things were all right. During the inclusive era, we had US dollars and other currencies, things were all right. Work was fun. When the inclusive government got out of power, that's when the rates were introduced in the shops. So for those of you who may not know, the inclusive government, or the government of national unity, was a power sharing agreement between ZANU-PF and both MDC opposition parties that happened between 2009 and 2013. And generally, life was a bit better, just a bit like manageable during this time, because there was all these currencies, like people could go into shops and buy food with the US dollars or rands. And so there like wasn't these like severe cash shortages that we have right now. In the same interview, Alec tells me, and in this quote, it was so rich, I felt like what Alec was saying, that I didn't actually translate it. But a loose translation of what Alec says in that bottom bullet point is that if things get better at the top, and then at the bottom, things will also be better. But if they don't, if things remain the way they are, then he says something, he says, "Wari pasi tino kwara," and that just means those of us at the bottom will literally get hurt, or yeah, we'll suffer. And what I loved so much about what he said there is that we can see the continuity between these like massive, like economic policies, like these big grand ideas that the Reserve Bank introduces, and then we like are following the thread and following the thread through education and seeing how it actually impacts and just leaves and introduces a severe state of precarity for the ordinary person in the everyday, of which Alec is not really the ordinary person because Alec is employed, right? Most people are actually unemployed and in the informal sector, but Alec, as a general hand at PE, he's actually in formal employment, but still struggling. So, key takeaways. What does this tell us about identity in Zimbabwe today? There is erasure of valuing labor, which I just pointed out, and yet this labor is tied to the state and everyday life, which I also just pointed out. But back to land. So a common theme, obviously, in this presentation was seeing erasure in labor and erasure in land. But back to land, these two images here are images that I also took in the field at PE. And I'll start off with the first image. So the first image is of Rhodes House, Rhodes Hostel, which is actually now Shashi Hostel. But I don't know if you remember earlier in the interview, I spoke of Denzel and how he mentioned that they tried to change the name of the school, but they couldn't. So when they couldn't, they decided to change the names of the hostels. And so Rhodes is now Shashi, like I said. But for some strange reason, when I was going to interview the matron, I saw that the school hasn't actually removed the letters Rhodes House, even though it's no longer Rhodes House. And I found that really infuriating. It was angering, it was confusing, but no one seemed to care. In the same instance, in the second image, we see a sign for Tokwe Hostel. And Tokwe was formerly Salu Hostel. So here we see that the signage of the hostel changed. And you can't actually see the hostel. The hostel is in the background behind the Musasa and Munondo trees, which are indigenous to Zimbabwe. But what I found so interesting is both of these images exist on the same piece of land and in the same place. And I found that to be a really perfect example and depiction of these claims, these ties between identity and land. And so I think the most important key takeaway is that there are erasures and inconsistencies in how land has been understood and our ties as Zimbabweans to certain pieces of land. This is the case even as versions of the state, settler or post-colonial, are conveyed through land. Thank you.